Picture yourself on a February night in 1347, somewhere in the Yorkshire countryside. The fire died hours ago. You're relying on rotting straw between your father's labored breathing and your infant daughter's fitful sleep. 10 bodies pressed into a single room no larger than a modern bathroom. Somewhere in the darkness, a goat bleats softly. Your husband's hand finds yours beneath a blanket so rough it draws blood from cracked winter skin. This is not romance. This is survival. This is love in a world that gave it nowhere to live. And tonight, like every night, you will have to choose between desire and dignity, between intimacy and the eyes that never truly close. Welcome to medieval England, where privacy wasn't a right but a fever dream, and where married couples had to become thieves of silence just to touch each other without an audience. The year is 1289. In a probate record from Lincolnshire, a peasant's entire estate is listed. 1 wooden table, 2 spoons, a cooking pot, 1 mattress, if you could call it that, really just a sack stuffed with moldy straw placed directly on dirt. This wasn't poverty by medieval standards. This was normal. This was how most of England lived. Probate inventories from the 13th and 14th centuries paint a suffocating picture. Homes averaged 12 feet by 15 feet. Inside those walls lived parents, grandparents, children, sometimes servants or apprentices, and often livestock. There were no separate rooms, no hallways, no doors that locked. Just one dark, smoke-choked chamber where every human function unfolded in full view of everyone else. You cooked where you slept. You gave birth where your mother-in-law needed bread. You mourned your dead beside the same hearth where your children played. And somehow, somewhere in that crushing lack of space, married couples were expected to maintain physical intimacy. The church demanded it. They called it the marriage debt, a duty owed by both husband and wife, to be paid regularly and without excuse. But the church never explained how. How do you love someone when your aging father snores 3 feet away? How do you touch your wife when your teenage son sleeps on the other side of a curtain so thin it moves with every breath? In 1402, a woman named Alice Barber testified in a York church court her crime. She and her husband had been discovered behind the bread oven in their own home, the only corner not occupied by sleeping relatives. She was fined 2 pence and made to stand in the parish church holding a candle of shame. Her husband received no punishment. The neighbor who reported them, a woman named Margaret, slept 4 feet from their bed every single night. This wasn't an isolated case. It was the architecture of suffering. By the time the Black Death swept through Europe in 1348, killing nearly half the population, those who survived found themselves in homes suddenly, horribly spacious. But even then, custom dictated that families share sleeping quarters. Even then, privacy remained a fantasy reserved for the wealthy, and even among the wealthy, walls had ears. In a 1456 deposition from Norfolk, a servant girl described hearing her master and mistress every night through a hanging cloth partition. She knew the rhythm of their breathing. She knew when they argued and when they reconciled. She testified to all of it in open court, her words recorded by a clerk who likely smirked as he wrote them down. Intimacy in the medieval world wasn't private. It was a public performance you prayed no one mentioned at market the next morning. And the fear of being heard, of being reported, of becoming the subject of whispered gossip or ecclesiastical trial, that fear shaped every moment of tenderness. It turned love into something furtive and desperate. It made marriage feel less like a partnership and more like a crime you committed together in the dark, hoping the morning wouldn't bring witnesses. So couples learned to wait. They learned to listen. They learned the cadence of a household falling asleep, the specific quality of silence that meant no one was pretending anymore. They learned which floorboards creaked, which movements could be disguised as restless sleep, which sounds could hide beneath the crackling of dying embers. They became students of darkness, cartographers of stolen moments. And when even that wasn't enough, when the room stayed too full and the night too wakeful, they left. Out into freezing barns, behind granaries, beneath hedgerows in mud and cold. Not because they wanted adventure, but because stone walls and thatched roofs had betrayed them. Because privacy, that simple human need, had been priced beyond their reach. And tomorrow night, they would have to do it all over again. If you're fascinated by the brutal truths history tried to bury, subscribe now, because we tell the stories that make you grateful you weren't born in the wrong century. Let's talk about what happened when fabric failed and patience ran out. In 1478, near the village of Ashwell, a married couple named John and Eleanor Kemp were brought before the church court. Their offense: they had been discovered in their neighbor's hay barn after dark, partially undressed. They weren't committing adultery. They were married, had been for 6 years. They simply had nowhere else to go. Their home, a single-room cottage, housed John's elderly mother, Eleanor's sister, 3 children under the age of 7, and a hired boy who helped with field work. When the court asked why they hadn't simply used their own bed, Eleanor's response was recorded in stark Latin: "There is no bed that is ours alone. The judge fined them anyway. 3 pence in a public penance." The neighbor who discovered them, a man named Thomas, had followed them deliberately. He'd suspected they were sneaking away and wanted proof. His testimony was gleeful, detailed, damning, and entirely legal. This is the grotesque reality that records from Norwich, York, Canterbury, and dozens of other ecclesiastical courts reveal. Married couples, desperate for privacy, resorted to storage sheds, empty stables, the edges of fields at twilight, and when they were caught, society didn't shrug with understanding. It punished them, it humiliated them. It turned the act of loving your own spouse into something shameful because you dared to do it outside the boundaries of your overcrowded prison. The church wasn't just interested in regulating sex, it wanted to regulate affection itself. Confession manuals from the 1200s instructed priests to ask married penitents whether they had kissed with too much passion, whether they had touched their spouse's body with lustful intent, whether they had enjoyed the marriage debt more than was spiritually appropriate. Pleasure, even within marriage, was suspect, tenderness was dangerous, and privacy, that thin membrane between the sacred and the scrutinized, didn't exist. By the 15th century, something began to shift, but only for those who could afford it. Merchant families in London started building homes with solar rooms, upper chambers with actual doors and locks. Wills from the 1480s list feather mattresses, linen sheets, bed curtains with brass rings. Things that created not just comfort but separation. In these homes, intimacy began to resemble something like what we might recognize today. But for the peasant majority, nothing changed. They still slept on straw. They still shared rooms with extended family. They still whispered their desires in the dark and prayed no one was awake enough to hear. And here's what haunts me most. Despite all of this, despite the suffocating surveillance and the absence of dignity, love persisted. Not the grand romantic love of ballads and poetry, but something quieter and perhaps stronger. A hand finding another hand beneath a wool blanket. A glance held for 1 second longer across a smoky room. A partner who stayed, who reached out, who chose you again and again even when the world offered no space to hold that choice. In 1499, a woman named Marjorie Paston wrote a letter to her husband, who was away on business. She described their home, their children, the endless noise and lack of rest. And then, in careful script, she wrote this. When you return, we shall find our moment, as we always have. There's no romance in those words, only endurance. Only the quiet knowledge that love in their world wasn't about candlelight and rose petals. It was about holding on when everything conspired to pull you apart. It was about creating intimacy in the cracks of a system designed to crush it. And perhaps that's the kind of love that survives longest. Not because it's easy, not because it's celebrated, but because it's fought for in inches and shadows. The medieval world did unvalue privacy because it did understand the self as separate from the collective. You weren't an individual. You were a member of a household, a parish, a social order that watched everything you did and judged it accordingly. But inside those watched lives, people found ways to be human anyway. They stole moments, they built curtains from scraps, they learned the language of silence, and they loved each other with a fierceness born from knowing that no one, not the church, not their neighbors, not even their own families, would give them permission to do so freely. By the time the Tudor period arrived and homes began to include hallways and private chambers, the concept of intimacy had fundamentally changed. But it took 3 centuries of suffocation to get there. 3 centuries of couples learning to be quiet, learning to wait, learning to disappear. So I'll leave you with this. Imagine trying to love someone when every wall has ears, and every silence holds a witness. Imagine needing your partner's touch but knowing that reaching for them might mean shame, gossip, punishment. Imagine that being normal, that being life. And then ask yourself, could love survive like that today? Could you? Because maybe the most haunting thing about medieval intimacy isn't that it was hard, it's that it happened at all. That people found ways to reach for each other even when the world gave them nowhere to land. Maybe that's what love actually is. Not the space we're given, but the space we carve out with our bare hands in the dark. What do you think? Could you have loved like that? Could you have endured it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know if this story unsettled you the way it unsettled me. And if you're still here, still thinking about those couples whispering in the dark 700 years ago, hit subscribe, because history's darkest corners are exactly where the most human stories hide.